This is the 30th of August, 1997. We're in Columbus, Ohio. I'm Victoria Ekegren interviewing, and this is Marvin Bertelson from the 493rd. First, tell me, where were you born?
In Chicago, Illinois.
What year?
25.
Tell me about your family.
Well, my mother was Norwegian, and she came directly from Norway. My father's Swedish, and he too came in 1917, around there, at the end of World War I, and they both ended up in Chicago. And they belonged, my father belonged to a Swedish organization, Switchard, and we went to many picnics. He was a block cutter foreman for United Wallpaper Company, which Sears owned at the time. My mother was a housewife. And we lived on the northwest side of Chicago at Belmont Central, where there were a lot of various ethnic groups living on our street, and we used to play ball out in the front. There were Italians, and there were Polish, and there were Irish, and Swedish, and we all mixed very well and got along very fine.
Did World War I have any effect on you and your family?
No, other than they both came over to the United States to seek a better life, I suppose.
Tell me about the Depression years.
Well, I was very small at that time, but everyone was very frugal, and they watched their nickels and dimes very carefully. And things were very, well, when I grew up, things were very inexpensive. A nickel coffee or a loaf of bread for 9 cents, you know, that dates you quite a bit.
What are some things that you learned from your dad?
Well, he liked music, and so in that way I followed through with musical training, and ended up finally being a music teacher. From his Swedish background, I was very much into our roots in both Norway and Sweden, and we still go back to what they call the old country, and visit our friends and relatives back there every few years. And he was very much into lodge work and the organizations of Sweden, and I belong to Sons of Norway at the present, and enjoy that association and fellowship with them.
Describe your mother to me.
Well, she was very precise in her housework. Everything had to be very immaculate and neat and clean, and a lot to do around the house, and everything was just spotless all the time. And she made a lot of cookies, made a lot of things that we could eat and enjoy, and ethnic foods. And Christmas time was very special, and we had our typical lutefisk dinners, which nobody seems to like here in the United States, although we do have them at our lodge and serve about 1,200 people, so somebody must like it.
What are some other lessons that the Depression, you know, just that's something that you carried with you from the Depression?
Well, we had to make sure that we cleaned our plate and at mealtime, and I was very particular about spending my nickel or dime, and I couldn't make a decision over whether I should buy this or that or spend it on candy, and so I was pretty good at saving my money.
Tell me about your schooling.
Well, after grade school, I was in a midterm. I suffered an illness, and so my parents kept me back for 2 or 3 months, I guess, while I was recuperating. And so I ended up in a half year and graduated in January. And so that threw me off all the way through high school. I went to North Park Academy, which is a high school on the north side of Chicago. And I graduated in summer school then in 1943. I went to the college, and at that time North Park was a junior college. Now it is a four-year college. And that was run by the Swedish Covenant Church. And I graduated, well, the war broke out, so I was, of course, thinking that I'll be entering the service one way or the other, either enlistment or being drafted. So in January I was drafted before I could get 1 semester of schooling in the junior college. So then I went off to Fort Sheridan, Illinois as a new recruit.
How did Pearl Harbor affect your life?
Well, it was kind of a shock to us. I think I was going to a movie or something, and someone said Pearl Harbor was bombed. So that started everybody off enlisting in the services, and I was palling around with 5 other young boys my age, and 3 of them enlisted in the Marines, and the other 2 are about to go. So I was ready to go. I thought, well, I'd better enlist or whatever, but I was drafted in January, and off I went.
What did your family think about you joining the war?
Well, they were trying, of course, to delay everything if they could, but I think they accepted that. Everybody was going, so.
Did you talk to your buddies? What did you guys used to? What did you talk about? About the war? Did you talk, with your friends about it?
Well, we corresponded with those who went. They mainly went to the Pacific, and I went the other side of the world over to the ETO. And we corresponded and talked a little bit about it. Not much.
Can you tell me about your basic training?
Well, there were three or four of us that were from Chicago, and we all went to Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And we boarded a troop train, and I wondered if they knew where North Carolina was located, because we just circled half of the states in the south and the east before we got there. I think it took us 4 days. Of course, all the other trains had a higher priority than a troop train, so that's why we were sitting on a sidetrack for an hour or so. And I think we went through Florida from Chicago, and so I don't know. We ended up in North Carolina, and we went to instrument and survey school there in the artillery. Fort Bragg is noted for their artillery training. And so we had 18 weeks of basic training. Of course, we marched and drilled and marched. We had a sergeant that I think tried to outdo his competition. There was another corporal, and I don't even remember either names, but he wanted us to outmarch, outshoot, and outperform his comrade, so he could show off his raw recruits and what he did with them. And after a while, well, we did pretty well. We won the parades, and we won inspection and shooting at the rifle range and so on. So at the very end, why, he turned out to be quite a different person. We almost liked him. But I remember the first time or two he came in, and we had to inspect the barracks, and we had to inspect the beds, and you had to drop a coin so it'd bounce off the bed, and if you didn't make it, he'd rip it up and he'd make you do it again. But he brought in a lieutenant one time to inspect the barracks, and the lieutenant had yellow gloves. I'll never forget it. And boy, he started putting his yellow gloves under every sill and nick and cranny he could, and every one of us were just wondering, uh-oh, we're in deep trouble now. And so we were confined to the area or the barracks because the barracks was not that clean. There was some dust under the fire extinguisher or something. And so what they did was they took the garden hose and hosed down the whole inside the barracks with a garden hose. So after that, we were on our way to becoming more in his image as what a soldier should be.
Did you go to Camp Campbell?
No, I was a late arrival at the 12th Armored Division. I actually, after basic training, I was assigned to the Rainbow Division, the 42nd, at Camp Gruber. And so I was given a 10-day furlough before I went there. And Camp Gruber's in Oklahoma. And from there we went to Fort Sill the following month. And they told me that they were overstaffed, so that they were going to ship out some 50 people from our little group. So I figured, well, I would be moving out soon, and that was true. I, along with many others, were shipped to Fort Meade, Maryland, and which is a repo depot to fill in assignments of missing ranks along other units. So somehow or other, our Chicagoans all were shipped and sent out in various directions, and I was sent to Camp Barkley in Texas with the 12th Armored Division, and I think I got there around August.
What is the first thing you remember about Abilene?
Well, from Fort Sill we had immaculate quarters. We had a 3-story, it seemed like a campus, you know, a college campus, terrazzo floors and lockers, just like a dormitory. And across the street was a lush green golf course. When I arrived at Camp Barkley, we had plywood barracks. I don't know, there might be 16, 20 men, and it was very primitive, and I thought, boy, this is the end of the earth. Fortunately, the men that I served with and became acquainted with were such great people that the facilities, we just overlooked that somewhat.
Who's a person that you remember? Who do you think of first?
Well, I think of Frank Zeiner, probably.
Describe him to me.
And I heard so many stories about him. When I first arrived, everybody was filling me in about this and that. And one fellow was saying, well, you don't have to unpack because we're going to be shipping out. Well, I heard that back at the Rainbow Division at Fort Sill. But we did ship out in 1 month, so I wasn't there too long. What I remember of the one story was that at roll call in the morning, it's very dark early in the morning. I don't know what time we really got outside, but it was our barracks was way at the extreme end of where they were taking roll call, and Frank Zeiner would get out and put on his overcoat and nothing much else, I guess, and stand out there in the darkness. And when it got to his turn to his section to ask if everybody was present, he'd say, all present and accounted for, when in reality there was nobody behind him. They were all sleeping inside our barracks. And so that was one story I heard about Frank Zeiner. And then he'd hop back into bed and catch a few more winks after that. Just like college kids.
Did you ever go into Abilene?
Yes, I went there several times.
What did you do in town?
I mainly went to the USO. Once in a while I'd go and play the piano or make a record and send it back home. That you could send a message or whatever, or I'd call. Calling on a telephone was a real major occupation. It took hours to complete a call back home. You'd put in your order, and then the operator would call you back when they completed the call. Well, it would take you hours to do that because there were so many soldiers there that placed an order. And then I'd go for maybe some coffee and donuts or whatever. But
did you have a girlfriend back home this time?
I don't think so.
How did you communicate with your parents?
Well, I wrote letters, and then I called them on the phone. And my mother, I started, after I've heard other people writing their Army stories down, I thought, well, I might as well do this also for my two sons. So I've been writing my recollections of my Army days. And I found in my mother's possessions a shoebox of all my letters that she kept. A whole bunch of them. Must be 40, 50 of them. And from that, and from our book that the 493rd printed and the 12th Armored Division, I have pretty much what I did from day to day. So that was a good record. I'm glad I found those. So now I'm compiling all that in a few pictures, and so it's turning out to be a big, thick compendium of my experiences.
What are some training that you go through in Abilene? Can you describe that?
Well, the training in Abilene wasn't much because everyone was getting ready to go overseas. The training I had, though, at Fort Bragg, I remember doing the surveying was that we'd had aiming stakes and whatnot, and we'd have to measure distances, and sometimes it'd have to go over and under or around or in a little ravine filled with real thorny bushes, and we had to measure the distance. I remember getting all scratched up from that. But it seems like we used coordinates after that and to direct the fire, and a lot of it was tossed out the window.
What was your impression of Colonel Hartman?
Well, I really never met him close. I got in a few places where with General Ennis and others who were planning some strategy, but I was never that close to any decision making. Otherwise, we would have gotten through with the war much sooner had I been part of it.
Tell me about leaving.
Well, I remember I had to clean out the railroad cars or kitchen and get it ready for our travel to Camp Shanks, New York. Other than that, I don't remember much preparation. We just more or less sat around and waited for the time that orders were given that we would be leaving. And once again, I think it took us 3 days to go or more to get over to Camp Shanks, New York.
Tell me about the Camp Shanks.
Well, it seemed like we weren't there very long. We just started long enough to find a boat that would take us overseas. I remember either Fort Meade or Camp Shanks, where we played little basketball during the time that we were waiting for deployment. I went to New York City one day, I guess it was, and walked around Times Square and looked at all the buildings, and bingo, it was time to go back to the camp, and I think I caught the last train back, and don't remember much other than that.
Are you worried about the war at this time? Because now you're getting close to leaving.
Well, in basic training, every morning we had to appear for roll call, and then after roll call, they'd have the great big huge map, and of course D-Day had just been completed a few days before that, and the sergeant would map out the front lines all the time, and then the next day we'd go and would see what progress was made, and so we didn't miss the D-Day by too much. Maybe it was about 4 months before we arrived and entered combat. Yeah, I was very concerned about how things were going. I imagine that D-Day was just something unbelievable.
What do you remember about what was the name of the ship, and can you tell me about that?
Tasker H. Bliss. Yeah, I remember that. Sweepers, man your brooms, clean sweep down fore and aft. We heard that every morning, and oh well, I remember definitely the day we got on the ship, because that was my birthday, September 19th, and we were just loaded with this big heavy duffel bag and all our equipment, and we could hardly make it up the gangplank, and the sailors would help us at every corner and turn, and we had to go down to Dog 6, D6. That's about as far down in the ship as he could go, and boy, it was so hot, and we were all perspiring, and they threw us in this bunk, and we just stayed there until they loaded everybody in, and there was only about 6 inches from from the lower bunk to the top bunk, and but after we started sailing, that was early next morning. I wanted to get up early and see the Statue of Liberty, so I did that, and there weren't too many up there with me, but I waved goodbye to the grand old lady, and I was hoping I'd see her again.
What do you remember? What's your first encounter with England?
England, I believe we landed in Avonmouth, although they wanted, in the history books they say Liverpool, which I guess it's right next to it. When we docked, these shoremen were securing the ship, and someone threw an orange to them. And you should have seen them scamper for that orange. They probably hadn't seen an orange for months. And so a few more oranges came out, and we'd watch these shoremen run helter-skelter all over for those oranges. I guess that was a treat for them. And then we seemed like we hopped a train one time or other, I don't know, but we ended up with in Tidworth and the Windmill Hill of tents, and that was a little primitive. We were freezing to death because it was that cold, foggy air, and so we bought a blanket from the British, and everyone was given a second blanket so we didn't freeze to death. And there was like living out in the farm. You had your outhouse up the hill a ways, and a little primitive.
How long were you guys in England?
Not quite sure, maybe 3 weeks. We were stationed near Air Force, where the C-47s would travel and run supplies over to France. And they were so slow going, I thought, boy, they must be being shot down by the hundreds by the German anti-aircraft guns.
What do you remember about crossing that channel?
Well, it was a little choppy, it seems like. Other than that, it took us a while to cross. While I was in England, we did have a chance to go to London once or twice. That was kind of interesting.
What did you do in London?
Well, I tried to see all the historical things that I've read about and saw in the movies and whatnot. So I went around and saw Big Ben and the Parliament building, and I went to St. Paul's Cathedral. I was amazed at that whispering gallery. You could turn your head to one side and whisper like this, and it would travel all around to the person sitting on the opposite side, and he could hear every word. And went in Westminster Abbey, strolled around Piccadilly Circus, and I even went to a movie, and while I was sitting there, they flashed across the screen, air raid. Boy, I was going to jump up, and nobody moved. And, well, so I sat there, and I thought, well, I'll do what the rest of them are doing. And evidently, they've been used to air raids, and they figured, well, they're going to get bombed, well, so be it. But anyway, then pretty soon, all clear was flashed on the screen, and I guess that was the end of that.
What's your first impression about France?
France? Well, different language completely. And we crossed on an LST, and we were herded into an open semi without the top, you know. And these GIs, boy, they took off helter-skelter, and this was the Red Ball Highway we heard about, and they just raced down these roads and delivered us at AFA. But I thought that was quite a ride. And we ended up in a barn the first night, and from there we went to tents out in the country. And then we were on guard duty, and from there our battalion, or our C battery, went to Port Bale, France, and from there we were supposed to watch the Channel Islands. Someone said, well, there's 7,000 Germans out there in these islands. And what they've been doing was taking boats and coming into the mainland, and they'd hold up these trucks on the Red Ball Highway, giving supplies to the troops, and then they'd hop their boats and go back. Well, our recon section was assigned to watch the islands. We had a big telescope and binoculars, and 24 hours a day we'd have somebody in the outpost. It was a small building next to a large dormitory, and the battery stayed in the dormitory, and well, we stayed there too, but then we observed from this house next door, and all we saw was some civilian gathering up some seaweed every morning or whatever with his donkey and cart. Otherwise, we never saw any enemy come in boats and raid any express. That was kind of interesting. I remember hearing Glenn Miller and all the big bands. I thought that was great. We'd hear him over the BBC. And I especially like Glenn Miller and his music. And we'd hear all these programs over the BBC. That was kind of fun. It kind of kept us in touch with home.
What was your first experience with a real battle?
Well, everybody said that we entered battle on the 5th of December. My mother's birthday was the 4th, so I remember definitely the 4th, because we went up to the battle lines on December 4th, and the next day we were going to establish an observation post at this house or place that we parked our vehicle, a half-track. And that night we were sitting in our half-track, and all of a sudden we were getting shelled. Zing! And boom, you know. And I thought, oh, where should we go? What should we do, you know? So we're green troops, you know. If we were smart, we would have gone in a cellar of that house. But we stayed in our half-track, and the shells were coming in, and it sounded like rain on our tarp, the roof of our half-track, and the fragments. And the next morning, we could see holes all over the place. And so I think we were in combat on the 4th. At least I was with our Ridge Runner half-track and Harvey Shoemaker and a couple others.
Where did you move on from
Well, from there we went, we were in Alsace, Lorraine section, and a lot of mud and a lot of grief. In Singling, we were in a house, and Frank Zeiner and I were heading toward the front door when all of a sudden a shell landed up on the roof right above the doorway, and I saw a soldier walking with his mess gear. He just came from lunch, and evidently these tile roof or the shell fragments hit this young soldier and killed him right in front of us out in the street. That was such a sad day for us. I really felt bad about that.
What had you been trained to do during training? What was your task?
Well, I was a scout. I came in as a scout to Camp Barkley, and so I was with the Fort Observers, the FO section, with Zeiner, and our lieutenant was J.W. Arbuckle, and Penny was his driver, and Cliff Sells and Beckman and a few others, and Winder, and we would take turns going up to the front lines, and if the infantry needed some support with artillery fire, or there was a target, then I would relay on the radio the messages back and forth, and direct artillery fire on the target. And many times the radio wouldn't work, and so that was always a problem. We would always be the second vehicle, which isn't the greatest place to be in a combat line. So, but...
Tell me about your Arab servers. What did they do to help?
Well, if it was foggy or rainy, cloudy, or whatever, we couldn't see a target, then they'd ask the people up in the Piper Cubs to do that. Yeah.
What do you remember about Colmar, and when about did it take place?
Colmar, I remember that was a night that we were out in this long column and cold, and we've been without sleep for about 30 hours or more, and we were so tired, and it was dark, and we were in the second vehicle. The first vehicle, I think, was in Captain Dane. He had his painted white because of the snow in winter, and we're sitting there in the half a division behind us, or CCA, I don't know, and Harvey Shoemaker, the driver, said, "Well, I got to get some sleep, so you you stay awake and let me know when this lead vehicle leaves." And we're just on the outskirts of Colmar, and all of a sudden a little time passed, and we heard a big rap on the door, and it was the officer. "I think you better go, there's nobody in front of you." And unbeknownst to us, the lead vehicle took off. And so I got up and poked my head through the ring of the 50 caliber mount, and off we went, and lickety split, and I don't know, I was looking for that white half track, and And we get to town, and we just kind of followed the main drag, and all of a sudden I sighted it way off to the, and we did catch up with them. But I was wondering if, you know, were there any enemy troops that were going? Here's only one half-track in town that I know of. There probably others that circled around. But luckily we found them, and everybody behind us, it's like a rat race. I remember, though, after Colmar, we had another Herlesheim in the south of there.
Tell me about marching late at night. What do you remember about marching? I know you guys walked a couple of nights, all night long.
We didn't do much walking. We were with the half-track just about all the time. And, we would drive with these cat eyes, you know, and which are the lights that just have a little opening. Otherwise, it's all blacked out. And you try to follow the brake lights of the vehicle in front of you. And so sometimes they'd go, you know, and well, you cautiously follow them, and pretty soon you're quite a distance behind. And so then you speed up, and the cars behind, of course, have to do the same, and pretty soon they're going like 40, 50 miles an hour to catch up, and then all of a sudden they're stopped right in front of you. So it's a wonder we didn't have a few accidents following some people.
Tell me about Herlesheim.
Herlesheim, I wasn't the one up with the FO team, so I was in Bischweiler, and Arbuckle and Penny were up front, and they got wounded and sent back. And Cliff Sells came back one day, and he said, he told us, boy, things are pretty rough up there. So I was ready to go up, and he says, well, you better stay here. So we caught guard duty quite a bit. And one night, I spent practically my whole guard duty underneath the half-track, because we were being shelled quite heavily. And that was due primarily to our beloved tankers, who moved into a field of hops, which we didn't know at the time what the poles are over there with the ropes and strings across. And finally someone said, oh, they grow hops, you know, for the beer. Well, anyway, the tankers moved into that field and started shooting at the front lines. Well, when they did that, the flare of the gun just pinpointed where they were. So the enemy just shot back at them, and we were right across the street, and we were being shelled really heavy. And I was underneath that half-track for 2 hours. And Elmer Gelberg, he was telling our Lieutenant Arbuckle that he spent guard duty underneath a half-track, and Arbuckle said, well, which one was that? Oh, it's this one over here. And Arbuckle said, well, you know, that's the ammunition half-track. Ooh, not too wise of a choice. Well, there's a lot of funny things that happened in the war besides tragedies, from catching chickens to running over rabbits and all sorts of stuff, yeah.
Were you ever wounded in the war?
No, I was not. I was very fortunate.
What do you remember about the German people in comparison to the French?
Well, I don't know. The French kind of bawled us out for bombing their villages, you know, just because 6,000 Germans were there or something, you know, and they couldn't see any reason for that. I don't know, the German civilians, especially after the war, seemed very cordial. They even invited us over for dinner, Al Winder and I, and that was on a New Year's Eve. And I don't know, they just, it's hard to compare them. When we were in Alsace, you know, we were wondering what flag these people flew when the Germans were there, and then when we came they got another one out and flew it. I remember one time I think this was in Bischweiler or Schaffenburg, someplace. I found a piano, so I thought, well, I'll go play the piano for a while. So I sat my carbine down over in the corner and I played the piano. Pretty soon I could sense somebody was by me, and I looked around. This old gentleman was listening to me play the piano, and he was between me and my gun, and I thought, I don't know if this situation is too keen. And like I said, I didn't know if they were sympathetic to the Americans or to the Germans, because they all spoke German, and you know, Alsace, it kept going back and forth. It depended who won the war, the last wars, who was flying the flag. So he clapped and he said, keep playing, you know. Well, eventually I went over and got my gun and felt more secure, but he was harmless evidently, so that was nothing.
What do you remember about the fast movement towards the Rhine?
The Rhine, it seemed like going to the Rhine, we just went at will. We made like average 25 miles a day, and in combat that was kind of unheard of, to travel that far of distance. But an armored unit, well, I could do that. And of course we picked up a lot of prisoners and supplies and vehicles and ammunition dumps, hospitals, all sorts of things. Going into Ludwigshafen was a foggy day, and visibility was very poor, and I was with the infantry, I think. I don't know what unit, and we were in a long column of walking through this area, and the fellow behind me kept getting farther and farther behind, and pretty soon I told him, you better keep up or the people behind you won't know where we are. Well, it happened that there was only about 8 of us that were up ahead, and the rest of them I know where they were. So, but once again, nothing crucial happened.
Did you take part in the liberations of the concentration camps?
We were, yes, we were located very close to Herlock Lager number 4, and so a few of us decided we'd go over and see what it was like, and we came to the camp and very shocked at what we saw, and very awestruck. It was Sergeant Beckman, Gene Heinemann, and I. For sure, I'm not sure about Lazaga, and then another person. And I remember some of the scenes that you showed us, because the one where Beckman and 2 others are looking at some bodies. Heinemann went to get his camera, and I was standing next to him as he took their picture. And that's in our history book. And I've been speaking with survivors through the Northern California Holocaust Museum in San Francisco. So we go to various schools and put on assemblies for the high school students and show them exactly what we saw, and the survivors tell their story. While I show them pictures of what the camp looked like on the day we arrived. The guards at camp number 4 doused these huts with gasoline and set them on fire with the inmates locked inside. And so there were some charred bodies, and some were still smoldering when we got there. And the 4 or 5 of us, we were just so awestruck we didn't know what to say. We thought, how is this really happening, you know? And there was no guards around when our first troops arrived. They probably got put on their civilian clothes and took off, and no one ever saw those. In camp number 4, I don't know if there were any survivors. We saw a few wandering around the next day or so, but there were 11 camps total in the area, and around Landsberg. And the next day, when I saw one over at the farmhouse, I had carefully preserved 2 eggs. I don't know where I got them, probably from a farmhouse, chicken house. And I thought, boy, we can have these 2 eggs. So Al Winder and I went in this farmhouse, and I told the farm wife that I'd like cook these eggs for us, and so she did. And inside the kitchen was seated in the corner a fellow with the striped uniform of the concentration camps, and if I'd spoken fluent German, I could have asked him who he was, what he was doing, and a little bit more about him. But the smell of the farm wasn't that great, so we were in a hurry to get out of there. Went out for fresh air and had our cooked egg, which was quite a treat after eating Spam and K rations for weeks. But the concentration camp, the huts were built so that only the roof was above ground, and the rest of it was about 4 feet underground. And so in the wintertime, that must have been, and the rainy season must have been just terrible, damp and cold, and they had one stove in the middle, and they slept on an elevated platform, and I think they had like 1 blanket for every 2 people. So conditions were very, very poor. We noticed the emaciated bodies, so figured that they were being starved to death. And I guess all they had been given was like some potato soup. And I'm sure the cooks ate most of the potatoes, so it was probably all water before the inmates got anything substantial. And so at these high school assemblies, we go through all the details of their daily life and what they look like. Most of the victims weighed about 75 pounds at the most. Their joints, their knee joints and elbow joints seemed so much larger than the rest of the body, you know. And their fingers were just like claws, and their eyes were in sockets, so that they looked like just living death. Their ribs, you could see how skinny they were. And I don't know how they, I don't know if they were all shot or beaten to death, or how they met their death, but they were all pretty much lined up in rows. Even along the railroad track, we went over there, and I thought, well, maybe they were trying to ship these people out on the trains, so Americans, when they arrived, they wouldn't see this awful scene. But I think they just shot those people or hit them over the head. At any rate, I was 19 years old, and even my young mind, I thought, how can anybody be so cruel to people like this? It was kind of a ghastly sight, and a day which you know I'll never forget. April 27th, 1945, and we weren't there very long because we still had a war to fight, and so we had to leave. But I understand our rear echelon units rounded up people in town, some very well-to-do citizens, and had them view the scene. And Colonel Seiler and Sergeant Bear, he spoke to them in German and told them exactly how we felt, and that they, even though they didn't claim to know much about what was going on in there, you voted for their government and blah, 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 blah. So actually you are responsible to a certain degree as to what happened here. And so then they dug mass graves, and at least some of them saw what was going on inside these gates. Most of these camps were very primitive, nothing like Dachau. Dachau was a big, solid security prison with huge walls and electric fences. This was just a few, the guard towers were just perched on some posts just about 10, 12 feet high, and with barbed wire around it. And most of them were huts with, it looked like sod roof on the top, and buried in the ground. And we only saw number 4. The 103rd Division might have been there the same day we were, and saw maybe number 1 or whatever. I've been back to Landsberg, let's see, that 1995, and the only thing remaining now are the cement kind of Quonset huts of number 7. And I've been in contact with Bernie Marks, and he was a survivor of number 1. He lives in Sacramento, and he's writing a book about his experience as a survivor. His father was a tailor, so he was given a little bit extra privileges, and Bernie was 14 years old at the time, and he survived. And he's in one of those pictures that was taken inside the barracks. He's sleeping on the shelf. So he has a lot of photos of the concentration camps, and he was one day he was over in the women's camp, which forgot number 3 or one of those, and they were looking for him one day. Well, he finally got back to where he belonged. But we exchanged a lot of stories. So Landsberg was something that the 12th really remembers. Herlesheim and Landsberg.
Wow. how did you know that the war was coming to an end?
Well, I figured in April that the war was coming to an end very shortly because, well, we captured the Dillingen Bridge going over the Danube, and I think that's the most underrated achievement that the 7th Army can be proud of. I think that shortened the war quite a bit, whether people agree with that or not. I know one survivor in Dachau stated that. He said if the Americans hadn't come so quickly, there would not have been a Dachau because Himmler ordered Dachau to be demolished. But the captain, I think it was Commander Weiss, delayed the order for some reason, and he shipped out about 7,000 inmates one day on a forced march towards the Alps. And this survivor was stating that you know, they were going to just tear down the place and get rid of all the prisoners one way or the other, and because Americans came so fast that, you know, they didn't have time to do that. And I think this Dillingen Bridge had, where we captured it intact, allowed all these other divisions, I mean, there was thousands and thousands of Allied troops that went through Bavaria, and the strong point of the last resistance that the German army could give, and they were just falling apart all over the place. And didn't take long before we were practically into the eagle's nest. And we're in Nuremberg and Munich and all over southern Germany just in a matter of days.
What do you remember of the day when the war ended?
Well, I don't know. It seemed like there wasn't much resistance, and we ended up in Murnau, which is in south of Landsberg and south of Munich, and that was the start of the Alps, or we could see the Alps from there, and it even was snowing up there, and we just didn't, well, we had some resistance. It seems like the Germans would shoot an 88mm shell at you every once in a while at our column, and that would slow us down a little bit. But they were only the die-hard SS that were just trying to delay us a little bit.
What do you remember of people's faces at that time?
Well, I don't know. I didn't think there was much difference from one day to another. And when the 8th of May came by, why, we were all happy that that was it. And we felt, we were a group of, it seemed like the 12th Armored was a group of people from all walks of life that there was a job to be done. We'd go into service, hopefully win the war, and all go home in a short amount of time. And for me, it turned out that way.
Do you remember, can you tell me about Colonel Hartman's, I believe he spoke to all of you when the war is over? Can you tell me about that?
I don't remember that. No? Maybe I wasn't there. Yeah.
What do you remember about going home, seeing your family again?
Well, I stayed in and was in the Army of Occupation. We went to Heidenheim. That was our main. Camp and area, and after the war was over, And a lot of us shipped out to the 1st Armored Division. And the 12th, I don't know, they were going to go back and go back home and maybe pick up other soldiers. We were given points, so many points for every month of service and so on. And I had something like 45 points, and the rest of these fellas had 83 points. Mm-hmm. And going home, you needed 85 points, and so this one guy was all upset. I said, well, I'm sure you're going to go home on the next boat. Mm-hmm. Well, anyway, we were, a large group of us were shipped to the 1st Armored Division, and we were in Göppingen, Germany, which is not very far from Heidenheim. And because I could type a little bit, mm-hmm. I was battery clerk and mail clerk, and then I was even the reporter for Charlie Battery. So my column was Charlie's Chatter, so I had to write a column all the time. And well, that was fun. And then I joined a small group of musicians and played at the dances on the Friday and Saturday night at the 5x5 Club in Göppingen, and also the American Red Cross Club. And that was kind of fun. Well, the leader of the band was a piano player, so I didn't get to play all that much. So I picked up bass viol and I started playing that. And so I was proficient enough on that to at least get by and play with him on that. And then I'd play the piano with him. He shipped out finally, or had to go to the hospital for some reason, so I took over the band. And but people were leaving to go home all the time, that we were left pretty much with with piano and drums after a while. So.
What is the 493rd meant to you after the war?
Well, we get together in our association, and it's really a joy to see them every year. Every year I see a new group, though, because we move from location to location. We're either in Chicago, or we're in Washington, D.C., or we're out in Denver. So whoever lives close by usually comes. And in Washington, we did have a good group, because that was a place everyone wanted to see, I guess. And so I saw new people there. And Houston will be another group. Maybe I'll see my old friend Gene Thomas, who played the guitar in service, and he and I would play together quite a bit. And we'd look around for a house that had a piano in it during the war, and then he and I would play a little bit. And he'd show me the chords, and then I'd pick up some chords to play, and then I'd add the lead line, and that's how I learned some of the songs.
Do you have any other stories that I've missed that you want to tell me?
Stories? Oh, I was going to tell you about Hurlesheim number 2. Hurlesheim number 2 is south of Colmar. And this time, Sergeant Harrow and I, and had to be another person, were with the infantry, and I'm not sure which group that was. I thought I was scared twice during the war. This was the second one. We were in an open field and then heading towards the town, and there were some wounded German soldiers in the field, and we crouched down behind this big wall, and the German machine gun, the burp gun, was shooting through this hole in the wall, which was made by a large artillery shell, I guess. And these bullets were just zinging over our head, and I said to her, "Boy, you scared?" Afterwards I thought, wow, that's kind of dumb. But then I was worried about these Germans out in the field. They were still moving around, and I thought, gee, they could get a gun and shoot at us, and we're in an awful predicament here. But that didn't amount to much. We spent a night in that same house, and I'm sure the enemy absconded and they were gone. And we spent the night in the cellar of that little old house, and I guess we took off the next day. First time, I was a little apprehensive when we were with the supporting the 106th Cavalry. I think it was in Bolkingen or someplace. This was like the third or fourth day of combat. I don't know, maybe later than that. Well, anyway, we were in this house, and it was very dark. Well, kind of a moonlit night, but still dark. And we didn't know where the front elements were. They were up there, and all of a sudden we heard small arms firing, bang, bang, bang. And we were wondering, what's going on? We couldn't see. We look out in the street and nothing out there. It's dark. Pretty soon we could hear clump, 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 sound like marching feet. And boy, where did I hear that noise before? Finally it came to me. It sounds like hobnailed boots of German soldiers marching in the streets of Paris or wherever it was I saw on the newsreel. Oh my goodness, I thought, we're going to get captured. And it kept getting closer and closer, and we looked out the window to see what's going on. We're supposed to be forward observers for the artillery to help support this 106th Cavalry, who were veterans. You know, they had been in combat a while, and we hadn't. And so pretty soon it got closer and closer, and I saw all these soldiers coming down, and I thought, oh boy, we're in for it now, because they were just right out in front. Then I saw an American soldier with a rifle escorting him down. They were all enemy prisoners of war. So it's a good thing they didn't have to rely on us for anything until we got more seasoned.
Oh, do you have any questions? Do you have any understanding?
I don't know. I can't think of any too many. We're fortunate. Although we were with the infantry a lot, you know, and we had our share of liberating wine from the cellars, and there at the end of the war we went into a butcher shop, and boy, we had hams hanging from our 50 caliber ring, and we liberated a great big vermouth flask. It was this high, and we could hardly get it in the half track, but it fit right in the middle, so we couldn't even get to our radio. Well, anyway, that was a big thing. One time we liberated, some wine out of the wine cellar, and we were drinking that. And, oh, what was that? And it was so disgusting. We couldn't figure out what sort of wine that was. Finally, somebody said, "Why, that's vinegar." Grief. Yuck. So when we come back to the battery, they were way in the back. of the front lines. We'd get some good meals. Otherwise, we'd have to fend for ourselves and eat out of a can or whatever, or find a hen house that had an egg someplace.
Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I'm so glad I dragged you in here. We
Yeah.
have some